with the Transform Your Relationships show. I'm Laura Rubinstein here with the amazing and wonderful Dr. Rhoberta Shaler. Hi, Rhoberta.
Hello, Laura. What a wonderful world we live in, full of possibilities. So, we're going to talk about those possibilities and how they can be very directive or very overwhelming. What do you think?
Oh my gosh. Well, living in possibilities is access to freedom from spinning in the chaos like we talked about last week or last time. I think it's really a great tool, and it has its ups and its upsides and its pitfalls. So we'll talk about both of those. But in general, when I learned about living in possibility, it opened a whole new world. To it was something else, somewhere else to go, somewhere else to look for, because if you're stuck in this one track mind, it's just can go in bad neighborhoods.
Well, yes, and it can cause you to eliminate a lot of things because you've been taught that this is the right way. This is what you're supposed to do. And we inherit, adopt, and adapt so much from our parents that it's important to look back and say, is that my stuff? Is that what I want? Is that where I want to go? How does this suit me in my evolution? And we want to be making decisions about our possibilities based on our own values, not someone else's. So possibilities can cause us to spin in chaos because what do I look at? Where do I go? There's so many wonderful things, all bright, shiny objects. And then we can get into that sort of distraction, the purple squirrel kind of way of being. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, but I could do this or I could do that. So we need to understand that it's rich and wonderful and full. And our task is to decide where to focus.
And I think a great place to start with that is someplace we come back to over and over again is your values. What's
Mm-hmm.
important to you? What is it that really will nurture you, nourish you, help you in whatever your what area of life you're trying to work on, whether it's your health, your wealth, your fitness, your relationships. What's for the highest good for that value that aligns with you, for
Mm-hmm.
what is, I mean, a great question to ask oneself in any given point in time is what's important.
Mm-hmm. And remembering that you can't do it all at once. I remember a book that was very popular in the 80s, and it was called You Can Have It All by Arnold Patent. And I read that book and I thought, oh, that's promising people so much. So I started saying, yes, you can have it all, but not all at the same time.
Right.
Right? So we get into that kind of rushy thing. Well, I can go on a food program, I can get more exercise, I can do all these things, and then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Yes, they are all possibilities, but are they possibilities that are probably going to be able to be prioritized for me? Yeah, they're all wonderful, but if I can simply reduce my ice cream intake down to something relatively reasonable, maybe that's a worthwhile goal, while at the same time I'm going to walk an extra half mile a day. Instead of saying, I'm going to do a marathon and I'm going to lose 50 pounds in the next 20 minutes, we have to be realistic. The possibilities are there, but what are the possibilities that are probable for us if we
Right.
focus on them?
So living in possibilities means knowing your limits, knowing your time, your boundaries, your values, and then putting things into priority. What do you want to do now? And you can do it all, but you do need to make a choice. And we did a whole thing on decision making. So,
Yeah.
uh, you know, eh, making choices. If you don't think about them as right or wrong, you just think about them as taking you down an avenue. You can always change and turn around, do a U-turn if you need to, or back up and choose another, you know, fork in the road. As Yogi Berra says, when you see a fork, take it.
Yeah. Yes, and we can laugh about that, but that's how some people feel. They're like, which way should I go?
Right.
And we have to know, well, who are we right now, and what's at the top of our values, and what would we like to spend our time doing? If you are a young parent with children that are very, very busy, and you're busy and keeping up with the children and just trying to manage the home, it may not be the time to create some kind of goal where you're going to do a triathlon, because it's not going to fit. And this idea, well, I should be able to, leads us to this idea of entitlement. I should be able to do that. And we have to take responsibility for the choices we've already made. I've chosen to bring children into the world in that case. I've chosen a career. I've chosen to stay home. I've chosen to do these things. So now I don't just say, well, I deserve to do this, and it's totally out of the realm of what would work for the relationship and the family and the values. So we have to be mitigating ourselves in that way to say, at this age and stage, what actually fits, what's a little bit of a stretch, but is not going to put everything off the rails.
Right. There's always room for possibility, regardless of your responsibility. And not regardless, but including your responsibility, right? So it sounds like, if you have made certain choices, then given those choices, the question is, what is the possibilities? What are the possibilities? And I think a lot of people get tripped up on their confidence or their experience in the past or people blocking their way. So what advice do you have to help people move through these blocks?
Well, there can be so many. Maybe you've been told by your parents that you're reaching too far. Why can't you be satisfied? Or maybe you've been told by your parents, you're limiting yourself and you could be doing so much more. So you have to look at, where did I come from and what are my expectations of myself and life, and work from there, because you may have some limiting beliefs. And if you have limiting beliefs and you're trying to look at endless possibilities, you're going to have a mismatch. So start from where you are. What would be a stretch for me? Would it fit into my present circumstances? And is it in alignment with my values? And that's not something that you do in an instant. Unless you've done the work to figure out, what are my values? What kinds of decisions have I made? Are there any I want to change in order to embrace something new? That's what an individual can do. But if you're in a relationship, then you have to talk it over with somebody else, because they're affected by what you do.
Yeah.
So those are good starting points.
Yeah. And I find the more I contemplate, the more I get into thinking about and feeling into what is right for me. Where am I at now? What do I want? What are my responsibilities? Who's in my life? What's for the highest good? And I keep asking these little questions. New things come to light. New possibilities come to light. Oh, there's just, it's like it was right here, the answer, and I couldn't see it because I was just a little ahead of myself. But I backed up and I'm like, oh, there's the parking space. There's the, possibility for me to have more freedom, more fun, more whatever it is I'm looking at, more health. And it doesn't have to be like this big boulder in the way.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that I did a long time ago. I went to this wonderful seminar where I spent a week with 100 thought leaders. And I was really excited because the woman who wrote the book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, was going to speak there. And so she said something that really struck me and has stayed with me forever. And this saying that parents have and other people have, and they say, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. So you can't take piano lessons because you can't just try it out. You got to stick with it. You can't just play around at basketball. You got to either make a commitment, But if we look at this idea, she posed this question: if something is so worth doing, why isn't it worth experienced half-assed? Why not try it? So we remove the idea of perfectionism and the have to and the must, and say, well, let me try it. And I'll give you an example, Laura. My eldest grandchild, he is musical, and he didn't know what instrument appealed to him. And so I applied that idea, and I said, okay, I will set up a contract with a place that rents musical instruments. And you have the right to change instruments every 3 months until you decide what you want, and then I'll buy it. That freed him up. He didn't have to make a commitment. He didn't have to make a decision. It allowed him to say, I don't like this for these reasons. I'd like to try that. And eventually he found his instrument, which was great. But if it had been the other thing, like my mother said to me, well, we rented you a piano, and if we ever have to tell you to practice, it's going back.
Yeah, there's
No
different.
possibilities,
No
right?
possibility. We definitely want to live in possibilities. And I heard a similar quote, except kind of the opposite. And really, I heard that it was it Walt Disney who said it? Maybe not. But anyway, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly at first. Because
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
can't expect to be good at it. I once had a conversation with someone. She's like, I'm not going to try hard to do art. I'm so good at this other thing in my life that if I'm bad at something to begin with, it'll crush my ego or, and I'm like, oh, bummer. You can't go there and play like a kid and be in possibility because you're not going to be good typically at something right off the bat. What's, that you've never done before.
Right.
But you have a
Yeah.
kind of an interest in, and you might find that you like after all, and it
Why
might bring.
shouldn't you experience it? Why
Yes,
shouldn't you just have the experience
yeah,
and
and
see?
I think that brings us to this topic. What is the difference between expectations and possibilities?
Mm-hmm. Well, possibilities get shut down by expectations in many cases.
Yes, they do, right?
Because you'll immediately start arguing for the limitations in your head. Richard Bach wrote a book called Illusions, and in that book he said this: argue for your limitations, and they're yours. So as soon as you start saying, well, I can't because, you have to ask yourself, am I arguing for my limitations, or are I refusing to see I could create a new pathway?
Yeah. And when an expectation isn't met, you're disappointed. When a possibility doesn't happen, it's still a possibility.
That's true too. Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Well said.
Like, yeah.
It doesn't kill it.
No, it's
It's
still
just,
possible. It's just not yet. If you had an expectation it was going to happen at this point, great. If it's and then if it's not now, it might be something else, or not this way, it might be something else. So possibility leads to possibility, leads to possibility to possibility. And I just love that concept of like, okay, so if I'm feeling stuck, if I got into my disappointment expectation mode, then I can flip out of it by saying, well, what's possible?
mm-hmm. What
You
could
know,
I do now?
what could I do now? What might have opened up as a result of what, and like you always say, for what might this be good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I love this uh, perspective changer. And when your perspective changes, answers are in front of you. You just have to ask the right question. So I like the opportunity. I take the opportunity to ask questions of myself that, when I catch myself, become these curiosity questions versus like questions that put the brakes on the brain. Like, why can't I do this? Instead, I wonder how I can do this. The brain
Yeah.
is like now looking for that answer, and the
Mm-hmm.
answer can then be seen if you ask the question. And that's how I like to do my contemplation and inquiry, is like ask a question, ask another question, just keep the questions on the curious side. Like, I wonder,
Mm-hmm.
just add
Mm-hmm.
that I wonder statement in there, and it takes you into that realm of what's possible.
And you can also play with it in another wise way, is to say, what if this were possible? What if this happened? What would I think? How would I feel? And you can take yourself on a little journey to say, oh, that's not as exciting as I thought it was, or that might be good for another time. It's really not good for me now. Instead of being so directed that I have to make a decision. I think one of the things that we do, Laura, when we start even thinking about endless possibilities, or we start making a plan, is we think that there has to go in big chunks. And we've talked about it so often. I call them TTDCs, do things in teeny tiny doable
Oh, chunks.
chunks,
I love that.
so that we have this idea like, okay, I can try it. I can put my toe in the water. I don't have to jump in. I don't even know how to swim, and I'm going to jump in and say, how am I doing so far? Do I like it so far? No, I'm petrified. But
Hmm.
if I had started just getting used to the water, and then the playing in the water, sitting down in 5 inches of water, and I became accustomed to it. I like this, I don't like that. Maybe I could go more in that direction. And we're kind to ourselves, and we we don't force things upon ourselves, and we don't have that rigid mindset we talked about at the beginning. Like you got to do it. You're there, and if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. All of that. No, it isn't.
Hmm.
It may become worth doing well because you love it, but it isn't inherently worth doing well. Just because somebody else does it well doesn't make it
Right.
worth doing well for you.
Yeah, don't use other people's words and language and even the little words and language against yourself. Be kind. Do say nice things. When I hear friends, you know, saying mean things to themselves, basically, I'm like, don't be mean to my friend. Be nice. you know,
Yeah, exactly.
what would you say to a little kid or a baby or your best friend about this? And then you can stay in that realm of possibility and not your past or your fear or your worries. It's like it's I love what you do with Emerging Empowered. You show people how to access that place within themselves to take on their own power and live in their possibilities.
Yes. And it starts small, particularly because my community is about helping people who have had toxic relationships with parents, partners, siblings, other people, because we have to readjust our expectations of ourselves and see the possibilities that it doesn't have to stay like that. And how quickly can I go? Well, how quickly is best for me to go? Maybe I can't even make the decision whether I should stay in the relationship or give up the relationship. That's okay. Let's then look at your values and see how the relationship meets your values. Start breaking it down into those teeny tiny doable chunks. I can think about this bit, but I can't think about all of it. So it allows people to emerge empowered because they took baby steps and nanoseconds and were self-reflective. And then they got new skills, and they were, of course, in Emerging Empowered, my community, they get to talk to a whole lot of other people too, as well as me. And so they're getting insights and support. And we begin to say, oh, I could do that. Oh, you did that. I could think about it that way, and I could do that too. And so we're not jumping in at the deep end. We're wading into it, sure of our footing.
Yeah. And I love this concept of being in a community where you can get expert wisdom, you can get other people's wisdom, you can start thinking in new ways. Because remember, when I talked about in the beginning, is like right now we're in this little bubble of our own thinking space, but there's so much more out there for us. There's so many different ways to look at things. There's so many new skills and ideas and concepts and tools and ways to look at things and respond to things that can change our whole experience of our life and can transform our situations. I mean, that's one of the reasons I created the Feminine Power cards. And I'm starting to get back into putting together like-minded women to talk about these things, because as women take on their power as well, and we kind of tap back into, there's a whole well of resources within us that we
Yeah.
kind of just are blinded by all the conversations and all the different notions we've had about how things should be, or how things are responsibilities. But there's so much more out there for us that we can tap into with just a little bit of community connection, expertise, and just new opening up to I wonder, like the whole I wonder into that possibilities.
Mm-hmm. And being able to say, here is where I am. For many people, they're not ready to say that. So to go through the process of being able to say, well, I do find myself right here at this moment. I'm accurately assessing it. I know how to. And then when you've spent enough time there realizing and recognizing what's going on, then you can make your decisions as to what would you like to build.
Right.
And then you can rebuild your life in that image. And so for the people in Emerging Empowered community, we have to look at, do you want to leave? Is that what's going to be the most important thing? What are all the things that you have to think about? Your children, your finances, your living accommodation. How do we slowly wade through all that water until we make a decision to dive out of the relationship? And then what waters are we diving into? To be prepared to know what that looks like, what that's going to call forth from us, and know what resources we need in order to do that. So getting away from this idea of instantly saying, oh, I'm going to go in this direction and do all of this, to saying I could, or as you say, I wonder if I did this, how would I feel? And be gentle with yourselves. Just be gentle with yourselves. There's so much harsh expectation in life. So when you're talking to yourself, as Laura said, be kind to yourself. When you're saying, I could, I'd like to eradicate the word should out of our lexicon. These are all possibilities. I could do that, but perhaps not now, or perhaps it's not really for me. It's just something that I appreciate. And being self-reflective enough to know what's best for me next, and get help if you need it.
Amen. Love it. May you live in possibilities and come back to that. And if you need support, we're here for you. Thank you, Dr. Rhoberta. We will be back in a few weeks with more stimulating, transform your relationships conversations.
We will for sure. Thanks, Laura. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.